In 1836, a wealthy British sugar plantation owner sat down and wrote a letter that would change the fate of over 200,000 human lives. His name was John Gladstone, and his son would go on to become one of the most powerful prime ministers in British history. But John Gladstone was not thinking about politics that day. He was thinking about something far more urgent. He was thinking about money, because his sugar plantations in a small British colony on the northern coast of South America were dying, not from disease, not from drought, from something the British Empire had not fully anticipated. The enslaved Africans who had built his fortune were about to be freed, and John Gladstone needed to find a way to replace them, fast. That letter, sent to a recruiting firm in Calcutta, India, would set into motion one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Over the next 80 years, nearly 240,000 men, women and children would be shipped from the villages of India to the muddy sugar fields of British Guiana. They were told they were going to a paradise. They were told they would earn good wages, live comfortably, and return home wealthy in just 5 years. Almost none of that was true. What awaited them was a system so brutal that one of British Guiana's own Chief Justices would later call it a monstrous system rooted in slavery. The renowned British historian Hugh Tinker would spend years studying it and come to an even more damning conclusion. He called it simply a new system of slavery. But here is what makes this story far more disturbing than most people realize. This was not ancient history. The last ship carrying indentured Indians did not leave British Guiana until well into the 20th century. And the consequences of what John Gladstone started with that single letter in 1836 are still tearing the country apart today. The ethnic divisions, the political violence, the rigged elections, the fear that one community will dominate the other. All of it traces back to a decision made by one man who needed cheap labor to keep his sugar profits flowing. This is the story that most history books leave out. And by the end, you will understand why Guyana, a country most people cannot even find on a map, may hold the key to understanding one of the greatest human rights tragedies of the modern world. Let us begin where the nightmare started. Not in Guyana, but in India. The recruiting firm that received John Gladstone's letter was called Gillanders, Arbuthnot and Company, based in Calcutta. And their response tells you everything you need to know about how this system worked. They wrote back to Gladstone and told him they foresaw no difficulty in obtaining workers. And then they explained why. They said, and this is critical, that the natives, being perfectly ignorant of the place they agree to go to, or the length of the voyage they are undertaking. Read that again. The entire scheme was built on deception from the very first day. The recruiters knew that the people they were signing up had no idea where they were going, how far the journey was, or what awaited them on the other side of the world. And that was not a flaw in the system. That was the system. Gladstone requested 100 young, active, able-bodied labourers for his plantations, Vredenhoop and Vredenstein, on the western coast of Demerara. The British government approved his petition, and on January 13, 1838, the first ship, the Whitby, set sail from Calcutta, carrying 267 Indians into the unknown. A second ship, the Hesperus, departed 16 days later with another 171 passengers. Both ships arrived in British Guiana on the same day, May 5, 1838. Between them, only 396 Indians stepped onto Guyanese soil. The rest had died during the voyage. Think about that for a moment. Before a single Indian had set foot on a single plantation, people were already dying. The journey lasted over 100 days. The ships were overcrowded. The food was inadequate. Fresh water was scarce. Cholera, dysentery, and diarrhea swept through the lower decks. On some of these early voyages, the mortality rate reached as high as 20 to 30%. And there was something else. A young surgeon named Theophilus Richmond kept a diary aboard the Hesperus. His account describes conditions that eerily mirrored the transatlantic slave ships that had crossed these same waters just years before. The laborers were packed below deck, confused, frightened, and with no real understanding of what they had agreed to. Many had been lied to. Some had been kidnapped outright. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, something remarkable happened. The Indians aboard those ships forged bonds that would outlast the voyage itself. They called each other Jahaja Bai and Jahaja Ban, ship brothers and ship sisters. These were not blood ties, they were survival ties. Strangers from different regions of India, speaking different languages, following different faiths, bound together by the shared horror of a journey none of them had chosen freely. Those bonds would become one of the few sources of strength they would carry into the sugar fields. Now, if you are finding this story as gripping as I think you are, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We are building something special here, and we are on our way to 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world, and there is so much more of this story left to uncover. Trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. When the Indians arrived in British Guiana, they were inspected like livestock and distributed to various sugar estates. The contracts they had signed, or in many cases, had been tricked into signing, bound them to a single plantation for 5 years. They could not leave, they could not negotiate, they could not refuse. In exchange, the plantation owners were supposed to provide fixed wages, basic housing, food, and marginal medical care. What they actually received was something else entirely. The housing was not housing. It was the same cramped, filthy barracks that the enslaved Africans had lived in before them. Entire families were crammed into small rooms, with no privacy, no ventilation, and no sanitation. Clean water was a luxury. Disease was constant. The food rations were meager and nutritionally worthless, leading to widespread malnutrition. Workers weakened by hunger were then expected to perform 12 to 16 hours of backbreaking labor in the sugar fields under the blazing tropical sun, using primitive hand tools that had barely changed since the days of slavery. And here is the part that makes your blood run cold. The punishment system was almost identical to slavery. Workers who failed to meet their daily production quotas were beaten. Workers who complained were flogged. Workers who tried to leave the plantation were arrested, imprisoned, and returned to their owners, because that is what the planters were, owners. The contracts may have called them employers. But when a human being cannot leave, cannot refuse work, and can be physically punished for disobedience, the word employment is just a polite fiction covering something much darker. There was no overtime pay. There was no day of rest. There was no protection from abuse. And for the women, the nightmare was compounded by another horror that rarely gets spoken about. The severe shortage of women among the indentured population, sometimes as few as 22 women among nearly 400 arrivals, created a devastating imbalance. Women were vulnerable to sexual exploitation by plantation overseers and managers. They were treated as property within a property, and their suffering has been largely erased from the historical record. But the Indians were not passive victims. From the very beginning, they fought back. They ran away from plantations. They refused to work. They sabotaged machinery. They organized work stoppages. And the women resisted in their own ways, protesting against sexual violence and the conditions that enabled it. Every act of defiance carried enormous risk. The punishment for resistance was severe, sometimes flogging, sometimes imprisonment, sometimes both. But they resisted anyway, because the alternative was to accept that they were less than human. And that they refused to do. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect. Because the brutality of indentured labor was not a secret. It was not hidden from the world. Almost immediately after the first ships arrived, a campaign erupted in Britain and India that drew direct comparisons to the slave trade. On August 1st, 1838, just months after the Whitby landed, a committee was appointed to investigate the export of Indian labor. Reports of abuse flooded in, and on May 29, 1839, The British government actually banned overseas manual labour emigration. Anyone caught facilitating it could be fined 200 rupees or jailed for 3 months. So the system was stopped. Justice was served. The Indians were saved. Except none of that happened. The ban was temporary. By 1842, immigration was authorized again to Mauritius. By 1845, it was reopened to the West Indies. The sugar lobby was simply too powerful, the profits too enormous, and the lives of Indian laborers too expendable for the ban to hold. The system resumed, and it would not stop again until 1917, when a combination of rising Indian nationalist pressure and declining profitability finally forced the British to shut it down. By then, nearly 240,000 Indians had been shipped to British Guiana alone. Of those, about 75,000 eventually returned to India. The rest stayed, either because they chose to, because they could not afford the passage home, or because after years of servitude, they had nowhere left to go back to. And this is where the story splits into 2 threads that would eventually collide with devastating consequences. The first thread is about survival. When indentured contracts expired, many Indians found themselves in an impossible position. The plantation system had been their entire world, providing, however miserably, food and shelter. Without contracts, they had nothing. No land, no savings, no safety net. Some re-indentured, signing up for another 5 years of servitude because starvation was the only alternative. But many others did something extraordinary. They pooled whatever meager resources they had and began buying small plots of land. They became rice farmers, cattle keepers, small shopkeepers. They built communities from nothing. They established temples and mosques, kept alive the stories of the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita, and passed down traditions that connected them to a homeland most of them would never see again. The British, of course, had other plans for them. Colonial policy was openly aimed at converting the Indians to Christianity and stamping out their Hindu and Muslim faiths. The Indians were prevented from moving freely, which made it nearly impossible to form the kind of unified religious communities that could resist conversion. But they persisted. In secret gatherings, in whispered prayers, in stories told to children at night, they held on to who they were. Christian missionaries had remarkably little success in those early decades. The faith of the indentured Indians proved far more resilient than the British had anticipated. But here is the painful truth that comes next. Over time, isolation, poverty, and relentless pressure did erode aspects of Indian cultural identity in Guyana. Languages were lost, traditions were diluted, and after Guyana gained independence in 1966, the Hindu community became particularly vulnerable. Guyana remained one of the poorest countries in South America, and economic desperation made people susceptible to conversion in ways that cultural pressure alone never could. Today, approximately 24% of Guyana's population identifies as Hindu. The numbers have been declining for decades, but the community has not surrendered. Various organizations continue to work to preserve Hindu traditions, build temples, and educate younger generations about the faith their ancestors carried across the ocean in chains. Now here is the second thread, and this one is far more explosive. When the British brought Indians to Guyana, they did not just import laborers, they imported a racial hierarchy, and they did it deliberately. The colonial administrations systematically favored Indo-Guyanese workers over Afro-Guyanese workers during the indentured period. This was not accidental, it was strategy. By creating competition and resentment between the 2 largest ethnic groups, the British ensured that neither would unite against them. It is one of the oldest tricks in the colonial playbook: divide and conquer. And in Guyana, it worked with devastating precision. The distrust began on the ships themselves. Afro-West Indian sailors served as crew members on the same vessels that carried Indian laborers as human cargo. From the very first moment of contact, the power dynamic was poisoned. On the plantations, the separation deepened. Indians and Africans lived in separate quarters, Africans were placed in supervisory positions over Indian workers by the British, creating a hierarchy of exploitation where the formerly enslaved were given authority over the newly indentured. It was a calculated cruelty. The British knew exactly what they were doing. They were building resentment into the architecture of the colony itself. Cultural differences made the divide even wider. The Indians spoke Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and other languages from the subcontinent. The Afro-Guyanese spoke English and Creole. The Indians practiced Hinduism and Islam. The Afro-Guyanese had largely adopted Christianity. The Indians maintained traditional dress, food, and customs. The Afro-Guyanese had, through centuries of enslavement, been forcibly assimilated into European culture. These differences were not inherently hostile, but in a colony designed to keep people divided, every difference became a wall. By the 1930s, the cracks had become canyons. The Great Depression devastated Guyana's export economy. Sugar prices collapsed, unemployment soared, and across the entire British Caribbean, workers rose up. Strikes, riots, and demonstrations swept from Belize to Barbados, from Trinidad to Jamaica, and British Guiana was no exception. The British government, alarmed by the scale of the unrest, dispatched the Moyne Commission in 1938 to investigate. What the commission found in British Guiana confirmed what everyone already knew, but no one in power wanted to admit. The colony was split in two. The Indo-Guyanese were predominantly rural, had retained much of their traditional Indian culture, and were largely excluded from national politics. The Afro-Guyanese were largely urban, had adopted European cultural norms, and dominated the political system. The Commission recommended increasing Indo-Guyanese political representation through greater democratization. It was a sensible recommendation, but implementing it would unleash forces that neither the British nor the Guyanese were prepared to control. After the Second World War, two men emerged who would reshape Guyana's destiny, and their story is one of the most tragic political partnerships in Caribbean history. Cheddi Jagan was the son of a sugar plantation foreman. He was Indo-Guyanese, a dentist by training, and a committed socialist who had studied in the United States. Forbes Burnham was Afro-Guyanese, a brilliant lawyer educated at the University of London, who had won the colony's most prestigious scholarship. On paper, they were the perfect partnership. One Indian, one African, both committed to ending colonial rule and building a new Guyana. Together, on January 1, 1950, they founded the People's Progressive Party, the first mass political party in British Guiana's history. And for a brief, shining moment, it worked. The PPP united lower-class Afro-Guyanese workers and rural Indo-Guyanese labourers behind a single vision of independence and social justice. In the landmark 1953 elections, the first held under universal adult suffrage, the PPP won 18 of 24 seats. Jagan became chief minister. It was a historic moment. For the first time, the people of British Guiana had chosen their own leader. The British panicked. Within 133 days, the British government dismissed Jagan's government, suspended the constitution, and sent in troops. Their justification was that the PPP was communist and posed a threat to stability. But the real reason was simpler and older than ideology. The British were not ready to let go of their colony, not yet, not while there was still money to be made. But the damage was done in another way. The crisis exposed the fault lines within the PPP itself. By 1955, the party had split along racial lines. Burnham took most of the Afro-Guyanese members with him. Jagan retained the Indo-Guyanese base. In 1957, Burnham formally founded the People's National Congress. The multiracial dream was dead, and in its place, a new and terrifying reality took shape. Guyanese politics would now be organized almost entirely along ethnic lines. Indo-Guyanese voted PPP, Afro-Guyanese voted PNC, and elections became not contests of ideas, but racial headcounts. What happened next is one of the Cold War's dirtiest secrets. Jagan's PPP won the 1957 and 1961 elections convincingly. After the 1961 victory, Jagan became premier and began implementing social reforms in health, education, and housing that were broadly popular. But by now, the United States was watching Guyana with increasing alarm. The Cuban Revolution had happened in 1959. Fidel Castro was a Soviet ally. And here was Chedi Jagan, an avowed socialist with ties to the Soviet bloc, about to lead a newly independent nation on the doorstep of the Western Hemisphere. Declassified documents from the United States government tell the rest of the story in chilling detail. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy personally approved a covert CIA operation to remove Jagan from power. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. The CIA would not overthrow Jagan directly. Instead, they would use Guyana's racial divisions as a weapon. Working through Forbes Burnham's PNC and allied groups, the CIA instigated civil unrest, labor strikes, and racial violence designed to make the country ungovernable under Jagan's leadership. The violence that followed was catastrophic. Between 1962 and 1964, Guyana descended into what can only be described as a low-intensity race war. Hundreds of Indo-Guyanese were killed. Thousands fled their homes. Entire communities were burned. Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese, who had lived side by side for generations, turned on each other. Manipulated by political leaders and foreign intelligence agencies who saw them not as people, but as pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. And then the British delivered the final blow. At a constitutional conference in London in 1963, they changed Guyana's electoral system from first past the post to proportional representation. This was done specifically to prevent Jagan, whose Indo-Guyanese base gave him a plurality, but not a majority, from winning outright. In the 1964 elections, Jagan's PPP won the most votes, 46%, compared to Burnham's 41%. But under the new rules, Burnham was able to form a coalition with a small conservative party called the United Force and seize power. Jagan refused to step down. He had to be physically removed from office by the colonial governor. Forbes Burnham became Premier of British Guiana on December 14, 1964. When independence came on May 26, 1966, he became Prime Minister. And for the next 21 years, he would rule Guyana with an iron fist. Every election under Burnham was rigged. International observers documented it. The CIA knew it. Declassified American documents show that the United States continued to funnel money to Burnham's PNC, even as it became clear that he was becoming exactly the kind of authoritarian dictator they had claimed to be saving Guyana from. The PNC controlled every government agency. The judiciary was compromised. The military and police were overwhelmingly Afro-Guyanese and loyal to Burnham personally. The Indo-Guyanese were systematically marginalized. Violence against them was normalized. And then Burnham did something that must have made the Americans wonder what exactly they had achieved. He turned left. The same man the CIA had installed to prevent socialism in Guyana declared the country a cooperative republic, nationalized the sugar and bauxite industries, severed ties with the British monarchy, and aligned himself with the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the non-aligned movement. By the late 1970s, the government controlled over 80% of the economy. The country was bankrupt. Guyanese were fleeing by the thousands. And the man the United States had put in power to stop communism had built something that looked remarkably like it. Burnham died in office in 1985. His successor, Desmond Hoyt, began slowly opening up the economy and the political system. But it was not until 1992, after years of international pressure and intense lobbying by Jagan, that free and fair elections were finally held. Chedi Jagan, now 74 years old, was elected president of Guyana. It had taken him 28 years to return to power. 28 years of rigged elections, political persecution, and watching his country be hollowed out by corruption and mismanagement. Jagan died in office on March 6, 1997. In a final bitter irony, The man the United States had worked so hard to keep out of power was flown to Walter Reed, the American military hospital, for treatment during his final illness. He did not recover. Now, there is something I need you to understand about Guyana today, because the story does not end with Jagan's death or the return of democracy. The wounds are still open, and in some ways, they are getting worse. The PPP has governed Guyana for most of the period since 1992. Elections in 1997, 2001, 2006 and 2011 were all marred by accusations of fraud, ethnic tensions and sometimes violence, regardless of which party was in power. In 2015, a coalition of parties including the PNC ousted the PPP. But the PPP returned to power in 2020 under President Irfaan Ali, after elections so contested that it took 5 months for the results to be finalized. And here is a thing that makes everything more dangerous now than it has ever been: oil. In 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyanese waters. The find was enormous. Guyana went from being one of the poorest countries in South America to sitting on one of the largest new oil discoveries in the world. The money is already flowing, the economy is booming, and every ethnic group in Guyana is terrified that the other side will control the oil wealth and use it to entrench their own power permanently. The country's winner-takes-all constitutional structure makes this fear rational. Whoever wins the election controls everything: the budget, the contracts, the jobs, the future. In a country where voting is organized along ethnic lines, that means every election is an existential crisis. Indo-Guyanese fear that the PNC will rig elections to stay in power, leaning on Afro-Guyanese dominance in the police and military, just as they did from 1964 to 1992. Afro-Guyanese fear that their numerical disadvantage relative to the Indo-Guyanese population will lock them out of power permanently, and that the PPP will direct oil revenues exclusively to its own base. These are not abstract political concerns. These are the fears of real people who remember what happened the last time one side had unchecked power. They remember the violence of the 1960s. They remember the rigged elections. They remember the hunger, the emigration, the feeling of being a stranger in your own country. And they see oil, which should be the greatest opportunity in Guyana's history, as the thing most likely to tear the country apart. And that, right there, is the legacy of John Gladstone's letter. Think about it. A British sugar baron writes to a recruiting firm in Calcutta in 1836. The firm replies that they can get workers because the Indians are perfectly ignorant of where they are going. Nearly 240,000 people are shipped across the world under false pretenses to work in conditions that a Chief Justice called monstrous. The British deliberately pit the Indians against the Africans to maintain control. Independence comes, but the racial divisions are baked into the political system. The Cold War turns Guyana into a proxy battleground. The CIA installs a dictator. Democracy returns, but the ethnic fault lines remain. And now, oil arrives, and those same fault lines threaten to swallow the entire country. 188 years, one letter, and a nation still paying the price. But here is what I want to leave you with, and this is important, because it would be easy to tell this story as nothing but tragedy. And tragedy is a huge part of it, but it is not the whole story. The Indians who survived those ships, who endured those plantations, who built lives from nothing in a foreign land, they did something extraordinary. They created a community. They preserved their faiths against relentless pressure to abandon them. They became farmers, traders, professionals, and political leaders. They wove their culture into the fabric of Guyana itself, so deeply that today, Indian influence is visible in the country's languages, its food, its music, its dance and its literature. The Jahaja Bais and Jahaja Bahins, the ship brothers and ship sisters, would not recognize modern Guyana, but they would recognize the resilience. And the Afro-Guyanese, who had endured their own centuries of slavery and dehumanization, built their own communities, their own traditions, their own forms of resistance. The tragedy of Guyana is not that these two communities exist. The tragedy is that a colonial system deliberately engineered their conflict, and that successive political leaders, both local and foreign, exploited that conflict for their own gain. The question now is whether Guyana can break the cycle, whether oil wealth can be shared instead of hoarded, whether a constitutional system designed to divide can be reformed to unite, whether the children of indentured laborers and the children of enslaved Africans can find a way to build something together that honors the suffering of both their ancestors, without repeating the mistakes of the past. That is the question that will define Guyana's future. And if you have made it this far, I know you care about the answer. So let me know in the comments. Do you think Guyana can overcome its colonial legacy, or is the damage too deep to repair? I want to hear your perspective, especially if you are Guyanese or from the Caribbean diaspora. Your stories matter, your history matters. And the more of us who understand what really happened, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend it did not. This has been the story of the Indians in Guyana, not just why they came, but what was done to them when they arrived, what they built in spite of it, and what their legacy means for a country that is standing right now at the most important crossroads of its entire existence.